Of Leonard Bernstein way back when I was a kid. Many of you remember that. Now, I'm not very good at the extemporaneous speaking. Gregory is. So I'm going to just read this to you. But first of all, thank you for your invitation, and also for the director of this building, who is Mr. Noah Perlis. He wasn't able to be here tonight, but this beautiful building was originally in 1895, it was the club of Columbia University. And we have a couple of Columbia graduates here. And then later on, in the later part of that century, in the 20th century, okay, it became under the aegis of Reverend Sun Myung Moon of Korea. And when he passed, it was delegated to what it is now, which is wonderful. It's an intriguing idea. I guess you'll all agree to create and implement such an idea. That is for a museum of art and creative endeavors. Now, in our recent meeting, Ms. Salo, Mr. Nissen, and I talked about many museums. And one of those is a place where my younger brother, he's 11 years younger, and he's a famous composer, actually making his living as a composer, which I am not. Someday maybe I did manage to sell one of my works a few years ago, which is a musical opera based on Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native, and you probably haven't read it. But when I read it, it exploded in my head, and very soon it will be produced in a different name. But my brother David, who used to work at a piano museum in Minneapolis, St. Paul, would preside over all these pianos that belong to Brahms, Mozart, and other famous composers. And when I went out to visit him some years ago with my wife Sarah, whose family is very near St. Paul, Minnesota, and we have a couple of people from that area tonight. Michelle Seipel, soprano, would you raise your hand? She's from Wisconsin, which is very near this. But it was quite a thrill for me as a pianist, somebody that I played piano at Eastman School of Music from the time I was 6 years old, and then later I studied opera, and I am now, combination opera singer. In fact, this afternoon I auditioned for Rigoletto for an opera company. I don't know how I did, but that's what I'm doing when I'm not doing all this stuff. So anyway, it was a big thrill to play on the pianos of Brahms and Mozart, and to realize, oh, that's why Brahms wrote those thick textured chords that way. So there are quite a number of museums which have failed. Hopefully this building in this museum will go forward and be a great success, and hopefully these productions which you are seeing will contribute to that. Okay, so I am digressing. I have been asked to explain to you some of the creative processes that we use in creating a musical or music drama. Now, over the past 35 years, I've somehow created 18 different musicals and operas. Some of them are music drama. One of them that's going to happen very soon is called Pride and Prejudice, which I produced and performed in 1997 with my first wife, Susan, who passed away in 2005. And it was a great success. And then over the past 15 years, a number of things happened. And this year, with the Ebola killing so many people and the advent of the horrendous terroristic people in the Middle East, I don't remember the name of them.
ISIS?
The ISIS, yeah. When you say ISIS, I think of Isis and Osiris, which is, but anyway, I thought this was the year to do the happy, lovely story of Pride and Prejudice, my musical, and it will be done later in June, which is why we have a tablet over there with my wife Sarah. If you can put your email or your phone number there, we'll call you and have you come and see that work at the Theater for the New City, which is a wonderful theater, and the director of that will be Ms. Lissa Mora. Would you raise your hand? She will be directing that, and she directed Tom Jones, which I did 2 years ago, another musical, and the star of Tom Jones, the Sophie. We're not talking about Tom Jones, the rock singer. We're talking about Tom Jones, the rather ribald story of 1750 by Fielding. And the girl that played Sophie, would you raise your hand? She's right here. That's Gloria McKenna. So anyway, all that said, this musical you just saw, which I have a particular affection for, was only my second work. And I wrote it in 1986, as I said, after I traveled to and spent a summer in Montana. And how many of you have ever been to Montana? Few of you, okay, but not all right? It's a very tough place, and the idea of a woman living in a side, but the real reason for that story, in my mind, is learning to love, isn't it? Learning to love. How many of you women could go out and marry somebody that was a smelly sheep rancher and end up having his children and living with him, you know, for the rest of your life maybe? There were many women that did that. Okay, so the first thing I ever wrote was the musical on Robin Hood, which all of us guys loved when we were kids. We all loved to make arrows and stuff. And I was a camp counselor, like many of you were, in the summer camp, not making much money. I think it was in the early 1970s, maybe later. And I had all these kids running around, hitting each other with sticks and punching each other. And I took a break that morning in a bunch of little elementary books. And I hit a book that fell out of the shelf, and it was Robin Hood. And suddenly, why not have the kids run around and hit themselves with sticks in the middle of a play? That would be so much better. So, you know, Little John, you know, like, I had all kinds of things like, my name is Little John, you pipsqueak now be gone, or else you'll land in the thicket when I toss you there like a cricket. Okay, I could, yes, a whole hour, I had about 15 to 20 kids. Many of the girls, some of the tomboy girls were maybe 10, 11, 12. So I made the Robin Hood a young girl, and the Maid Marian was maybe a 12-year-old girl. And everybody else was a mixture of that. And it was a great success. A year or two later, I was teaching in a private school, and I did it again. And this man's daughter, she was Maid Marian in that production. He came up to me and said, Mr. Thomas, that's the best show I've seen in years. Is it syndicated? I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know what syndication was. I mean, that's something they do with Desperate Housewives or something, right? All right, so now his name was, who was the guy that did American Bandstand?
Dick Clark.
Dick Clark. His name was Dick Clark, but he was a producer in television, a totally different Dick Clark. And of course, that was my big chance to get the show. And then I did it later when I was a member of the German school. I was teaching kids who were German how to speak English. So by having them do Robin Hood, they all got their English better. So anyway, that was the first show. And then 2 years later, a professional children's theater actually bought that Robin Hood. And they paid me the huge sum of $50 per performance, which seemed like $50,000 to me in those days. And so it started and it went forward. Now, I don't want to keep you sitting here, but I'm supposed to be giving you a lecture. There will not be a test on this at the end, by the way. Okay, so we've covered Robin Hood, and we've covered that. Now, as a performer of various roles in my youth, such as Billy Bigelow in Carousel. In fact, Michelle, would you raise your hand? She was in last year's Carousel on television. Some of you might have seen. Okay, I did all those roles as a singer, but all of the stuff that I was learning, I was hearing all this music, and I was a very good pianist, and I was able to, get those chords into my brain, and gradually something started to happen, especially from the songs of Schumann and Schubert and Brahms that I loved and performed very often. There was the problem of writing an accompaniment, which how many of you ever compose? I know we have some pianists. Okay, there we go. And then Tim, raise your hand, you're fine. But it's a guy named Schubert wrote 712 songs, and he died at the age of 31. So if you do the math, that's a lot of songs. Now, there was something I learned from Schubert, that whatever the emotion or whatever the character was, like one of the first songs he wrote, that's the Earl King, which is a kind of almost scary, it's a German story which is sort of akin to Dracula, or, and you can hear this marvelous, scary scale, right? And then in another one, you all know Ave Maria, right? That's a totally different thing. So the problem of composing in a musical became much simpler when I just went back and studied the famous composers that I had already sung, such as Schumann, and gradually started emerging the motivic idea of, that's very characteristic of a lot of my more recent musicals. Now, some of the musicals, the longest ones are Jane Eyre, which I don't know, that was a great success, and it's a story that, to me, there's nothing so moving as when Jane Eyre comes back to Rochester, who's blind and has one arm, and she says, "I'll stay with you," okay? But you may not like Jane Eyre, but I've also written, let's see, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I translated from the original French. I was a bit of a scholar in high school in French. I was a dunderhead in math, but French I was good. So it took me 25 years to write that. But gradually, as I got into the more recent musicals, such as O Pioneers, based on a Will Cather book, I began to discover that what really inspired me was strong women. I love women. That doesn't mean I don't like guys, but it's just all the stories, all the musicals I've written, whether it's even the part of Sophie in Tom Jones. She's a strong woman. Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, of course, we have Elizabeth Bennet, and the girl that just sang so beautifully, or Maggie, she will be Elizabeth Bennet in June in Pride and Prejudice. And then the handsome fellow that just sang and moved us, he will be Mr. Darcy. All the other parts I will leave open for now, but when I'm doing a musical, I like to know who's really handling. So anyway, the most recent musical that I've written has a motive, and if you want to know what a motive is, this is one. Right? That this creates a longer melody. Now, in my case of the beginning of The Return of the Native, which is about, it's very much about a woman who's really half Greek and half, well, she's not of just one specific nationality. She's half Greek, half English, and she has a tragic end. But this is the music at the beginning, and this becomes, I believe, her motive. It's very similar to Wagner. And yes, I love Wagner, even if you don't.
True.
I know. We all love, don't we? That was a tune from Lohengrin, one of Wagner's early operas, which I happen to love. Now, this is the beginning of the motive which I associate with Eustacia Vai. My music became more motivic, as did Wagner's music, and I'm not competing with Wagner, obviously, but that's what happened. No, the next thing, how does one write a melody and write lyrics to it? That's really what I can't read my own lecture, so I'm just going to do it. Okay, the answer is that there are many ways to write melodies. Lerner and Loewe did it well. Obviously, Sondheim does it. My problem with Stephen Sondheim, in the last few years anyway, is that he doesn't write melodies that I can go out singing. I mean, we can all go out singing.